Yeah. Hey, thanks for coming again. I really appreciate it. I really enjoy this. I hope you do too. And all right, the 19th century was so great to us. We're going to start the Louisiana Purchase, but then we're going to do the acquisition of Florida. There's the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, the Convention of 1818, and also the acquisition of Oregon. And really, in the 19th century, we got Alaska. And also, in the very end of the 19th century, we picked up Hawaii and the Philippines. So the 1800s were pretty good to the United States. So let's do Louisiana. The myth is that Napoleon put a gun to the head of the King of Spain and said, give me Louisiana back. I'll explain that in a minute. And then he sold it to us for $15 million, which was just the amount of money he needed to raise a new army and to build up a better navy. He was planning an invasion of England. There had been a very brief period of peace called the Peace of Amiens. It started in 1801, but Napoleon was about to break that. His word was no good, the greatest highwayman in history. And Napoleon wanted to plan an invasion of England. There's never been a successful invasion of the British Isles since 1066, the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror, who came over in rowboats with bows and arrows, for goodness sake. But Napoleon got caught up in that, as Hitler did, when he was attempting to invade England. It didn't work out too well. So that English Channel, many people have swum it, and that's the right word, but nobody's been able to successfully invade England across the English Channel since 1066. So let's do Louisiana, and I'll move it ahead. You could see it's going to be that tremendous wide area. It's going to be 828,000 square miles of land. Parts or all of 15 states of the United States were in there. Another way to put it, we got 538 million acres. 828,000 square miles. Don't check me out on that because I'm trusting a historian on this one. But that translates into 538 million acres of land, and we got it for 3 cents an acre. All right, so what happened? That area was originally French. It was called Louisiana, Louis' Land. It was named after Louis XIV, Louis' Land, like Big Louis in the mob or whatever, right? So Louis' Land, Louisiana. But then after the French and Indian War, in fact, even before the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War really ended, France gave that land to Spain. So Spain owned all of Mexico, Texas, Central America. Spain was really a great landed power, although it was declining militarily in other ways. So, okay, what really happened was this. Napoleon made a deal with the King of Spain. Give me Louisiana back. So it's called a retrocession. There's a good word for you. I'm intoxicated by the exuberance of my own verbosity, right? I heard that one in ninth grade. I never forgot it. In fact, I'm going to tell you something. When I get to Florida, we paid damages for something Andy Jackson had done, and we paid $1,004,471.44. How the hell do I remember? I can't remember my own birthday. Can't remember to come home at night, you know. No, some things. And that thing on Canada, 5,527 miles, the border. Another thing I never forget for some reason, 5,500. That's completely unfortified. There's not one military installation anywhere along that border. So we have the longest unfortified military or international boundary in the history of mankind. How about that? There you go. Yeah. All right. Canadian? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to conquer you. Just give us time. Just give it, and you'll be speaking English too. Yeah, Polk's coming back. All right, here's what happened. Napoleon made a deal with the King of Spain. He said, I'll give you, Napoleon was ruling most of what is now Italy. And which was a bunch of separate states, including the Pope's estates and all that stuff. But he said, I'll give you the province of Tuscany, which includes Florence, which was then one of the most advanced cities in the world. I'll give you Tuscany and Florence. You give me Louisiana back. You retrocede it. And here was Napoleon's plan. He was going to try to reconquer an island in the Caribbean called Santo Domingo, on which is now located Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You can see that, right? Okay. Haiti is now on the western end, and Dominican Republic, which gives us so many baseball players, for goodness sakes, is on, it's amazing. On the eastern side, remember baseball, remember we used to play that game? Now they're going to strike again. How could you expect guys to live on 10, 20 million a year? I'm a union type guy, but come on. If I was getting that much money, I'm not going to pontificate here. So what Napoleon's plan was, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo had been taken over by black slaves who are now free. A man named Toussaint Louverture, and that's the exact pronunciation, Toussaint Louverture, had led a rebellion, a slave rebellion, one of the few successful slave rebellions since Kirk Douglas led them in Spartacus or some darn thing. But I like that movie when Kirk Douglas put the hot thing in the guy's eye, the big giant, remember they got that? Remember that movie? Okay, but Toussaint Louverture had overthrown the white rulers of Santo Domingo. And what Napoleon's plan was to reconquer Santo Domingo, which now is the Haiti and Dominican Republic. It was very valuable in tropical products, mainly sugar, but other things. And Napoleon was going to make this the gem of the new French Empire. He was going to reconquer some lands that France had lost over the years in the Caribbean, and he was going to make Santo Domingo the central point of his new empire. And then he figured if he could take Louisiana, that would be a granary. So this 828,000 square miles was going to be nothing but a granary for this little island, but that's how valuable sugar was in those days. So the whole thing, this whole deal that I'll give you Tuscany, you give me Louisiana back, that all hinged on Santo Domingo. And Napoleon then sent a 10,000-man well-trained army, many of them, almost all of them, veterans of his previous wars, sent a 10,000-man army to reconquer Santo Domingo, so to speak, led by his brother-in-law. So here you go. And these were French, well-trained regulars. These weren't militia, volunteer. These were well-trained people who had fought the British and everybody else. And what happened is Toussaint Louverture started a guerrilla war. And he kept pecking away at the French because he knew that as soon as the weather changed and the yellow fever season started, the white people who weren't seasoned or broken in to resist yellow fever would die out. And to make a long story short, about 8,000 of those 10,000 soldiers were either killed by Toussaint Louverture or died of yellow fever. And overall, Napoleon eventually lost almost 50,000 men trying to reconquer Santo Domingo. I mean, come on, this was amazing. Toussaint Louverture was an amazing guy, military genius in a way. I mean, some of his men were fighting with spears, for goodness sake. They had some weapons conveniently given to them by us. You want weapons, go to the United States, you'll get them. Okay, so Toussaint Louverture gives Napoleon headaches, and Napoleon eventually says, look, instead of losing more men in Santo Domingo, another war with England was in the offing, which he would start in 1803. He said, what we're going to do is the heck with it. I'm going to concentrate on something else. I need some money to build a navy so I could invade England, maybe build up another army to replace the army that his brother-in-law Leclerc had just lost. So, okay, he at that very moment, as American luck would have it, we had negotiators in France negotiating to buy the city of New Orleans. Now, here's the point. Spain still owned New Orleans. It was part of Louisiana. We had the right to navigate the Mississippi River, and the Spanish in 1795 had given us, in something called Pinckney Treaty, the Spanish had given us the right to use New Orleans as a port of deposit, store our stuff there before we sold it out in an international market. New Orleans was absolutely the most vital city in the world to the United States, Thomas Jefferson said, even though it was owned by Spain, because all of our Western farmers, all of whom just happened to vote for Jefferson, they shipped their goods down the mighty Mississippi. They left them in the ports there, the facilities, the deposit areas in New Orleans and out to the high seas, and the American West was booming, absolutely booming, and we couldn't afford to lose the right of deposit in New Orleans. And when rumors came that Napoleon, under a secret treaty, which was the Treaty of San Ildefonso, if you want to know, but in 1800, that and $5 will get you beer at some bars around here, yeah. But what was the secret treaty at Spain? Oh, okay. But the Spanish were giving us the right of deposit, no problem. But if Napoleon got hold of that, New Orleans, what were we going to do? We couldn't push him around like we could push around Spain, and everything was going down the tube. So Jefferson immediately sent an ambassador named Livingston to France to try to buy New Orleans, and he was given permission to spend $10 million, and that was a lot of money back then, $10 million just to buy the city of New Orleans and a little bit of area to the east, which was now be the Florida Panhandle, basically. But $10 million just in essence for New Orleans. And they're negotiating, and it's at this point that Napoleon decides, because of Santo Domingo and Tucson Overture and all that, the heck with it. So he, in fact, Jefferson was so worried about this, he sent his top second henchman, his main henchman was Madison, his second henchman was Monroe, and he sends Monroe to help Livingston negotiate. Monroe gets there, and Livingston is shaken. And he says, what's wrong? What's wrong? Napoleon going to start a war with us? No. His foreign minister just came up to me and said they won't sell us New Orleans for $10 million, but they'll sell us all of Louisiana, including New Orleans, for $15 million. But we have to take the whole thing. So they're going to give us 828,000 more square miles for $5 million. He said, but should we do it? Should we do it? Monroe said, don't even ask. Where's the checkbook? All right. And we made a deal. And of course, there was no transoceanic cable, no internet. So Monroe really did a good thing here. He said, come on, you can't pass up the greatest real estate bargain in the history of mankind. So we bought New Orleans and all of that Louisiana for $15 million was the price. But that's even misleading. We actually gave the French $11.25 million. Every history book, every high school book, we paid $15 million for Louisiana. We paid $11.25 million. And we assumed debts that the French owed to American people, mainly from the arguments about confiscating ships and all. But Napoleon admitted owing us $3.25 million. So we agreed to pay that to our own people. So we only gave Napoleon a little over $11 million, and he had to pay a commission to some gold brokers from, believe it or not, the Netherlands and England. And he was by this time at war with England. But English bankers arranged for this money. So actually they bought Louisiana and then sold it to us, and we bought it for the $11 million we were going to, but then we gave them American bonds and we paid interest. So we wound up, if you stretched it out, we paid a little bit more. But I know that's getting too complicated. But by this, so Napoleon actually sold us Louisiana before Spain officially gave it back to him. And by the time we took it, France was at war with England again. European distresses equals American successes. How about this? In fact, it wasn't until late in 1803 that the treaty with France the purchase was basically finalized by May. It wasn't until November that finally the French flag was put up and the Spanish flag was pulled down. And we had already bought it, and the money was already gone. And then France held it for 20 days, and then gave it to us. So by the end of 1803, we owned not only Louisiana, but not only New Orleans, but all of Louisiana, 3 cents an acre. And while I have this map up, if you could see here, Puerto Rico is going to become a discussion here probably tomorrow. And the American Virgin Islands we bought in 1917, the only major purchase we made in the 20th century. We bought the Virgin Islands right there. The three main islands in the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. And it is Croix. I kept looking that up yesterday. Croix, it's Croix in English, I guess. But they're the three main American virgins, so we'll see that. All right. So we buy Louisiana. We double the size of the United States. And just as a footnote politically, because I can't resist politics, most of the farmers, most of the rural people voted for Jefferson. And when we added all this Louisiana area, who's going to move out there? Not urban people. Who's going to move out? Farmers looking for land. So they're going to vote for Jefferson. So any state that could be added out there is probably going to be in a Jeffersonian basket. And so it was. So you had to give his opposition party, the Federalists, at that time, led by Alexander Hamilton, you had to give them, you had to give some credit that they finally agreed to do it. Some Federalists voted against the purchase, but more than enough voted for it to get it through. And they put their country above their party because they knew they were really signing a death knell, perhaps, of the Federalist Party, which was strongest in the cities along the eastern seaboard. They were more commercially oriented, business oriented, and the Jeffersonians were more the farmers. So we get Louisiana. There's Toussaint Louverture. If anybody was the father of the purchase of Louisiana, it was not Thomas Jefferson or James Monroe or Livingston or even Napoleon, but Toussaint Louverture. And what happened to him, unfortunately, is when he was on the verge of completely defeating the French, which eventually his army did, he trusted the French, and he went to a meeting with the French to discuss surrender, and they captured him, sent him back to France, tortured him to death. So there's a lesson in that. Don't trust the French. Huh? Okay, so now I want to do the Treaty of 1818, the Florida Treaty, Webster-Ashburton, and then we'll get into the big one, the Mexican War, where we get all of that territory. So you can see all of this coming up. President Polk is going to be in there, and the treaty ending the Mexican War is signed in a little village just outside of Mexico City, Guadalupe Hidalgo. There were those of us who wanted to take all of Mexico, but we were generous. We only took 51%. And during the Mexican War, we actually settled a long simmering feud with England over the Oregon country, the 54-40 fight. 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude was the northernmost boundary of the old Oregon territory, and we settled that too. And then in 1853, shortly after all this, we bought some more of Mexico, the Gadsden Purchase. So we'll get all of that. Let's do the Florida Treaty. Ready? Well, the first Treaty of 1818, Convention of 1818, we called it. From the Lake of the Woods, right here, I'm obsessed with the Lake of the Woods, aren't I? I went out those pictures I saw, though, I still can't go over how beautiful that area is. If I were younger and not going to die tomorrow, I think I'd go there. All right, but there's the Lake of the Woods. From the Lake of the Woods, our boundary was delineated all the way to that point with Canada, was delineated all the way to there. Then from the Lake of the Woods to the Stony Mountains, now called the Rockies, we decided the boundary in this convention would be the 49th parallel. And another underrated thing about this, the secondary purpose of the Convention of 1818 said that the Oregon country, all of it, from southern boundary, which is where we are now in California, all the way up to 5440, Alaska, Sarah Palin could see the boundary from her home. It's a hell of a home. You can see Russia, you can see Oregon. All right. But that's somewhat true about Alaska, though. Okay, but anyway, the Oregon country, all the way from what is now California, all the way up to what is now Alaska, much of British Columbia, all of Idaho, all of Oregon, all of Washington, a little bit of Montana, that whole area, including British Columbia, that would be jointly occupied. In other words, Americans could go anywhere in that area, so could Englishmen. So the English coming out of Canada, the Americans coming out of Louisiana or wherever, any one of us could go anywhere in Oregon. Now that joint occupation lasted until 1846, when we divided Oregon by just simply extending that 49 degrees. But that joint occupation had to work to our advantage because we were there. And we were used to moving west and grabbing land. Very few Canadians lived that far west yet. Very, very few. Some fur traders, yes. The Hudson Bay Company had some investments there and all, but it was to our advantage. The longer you drag this out, the more Americans would rush in there rather than Englishmen. Because if you wanted to set up a colony from England, you had to send a ship around the coast, around South America and up. I don't know why the hell they didn't go through the Panama Canal. But that's the English for you. To paraphrase Churchill, you could always trust the English to do the right thing after they tried everything else. Only he said that about us. So the Treaty of 1818 was good for these reasons. It made our relations with Canada better, made our relations with England better, which eventually led to the fair settlement of the Oregon thing. All that's great. It settled the boundary, and it set up joint occupation in Oregon, which had to be to our advantage. Obviously, when England's, 8,000 miles away or more, and we're there, it's got to be to our advantage, and it was. All right. Then in 1819, we acquire Florida. And this is the Florida Treaty, the Adams-Onis Treaty, or the Transcontinental Treaty. How about that? The Adams-Onis Treaty, the Transcontinental Treaty, or the Florida Treaty. Florida had been settled by Spain. The oldest continuing city in the United States is St. Augustine, settled in 1565, or established in 1565 by the Spanish. But you remember that after the French and Indian War, Florida was given England. But then England gave it back to Spain after the American Revolution. So as we pick up the story, who owns Florida? Spain. Hadn't really developed it that well. And Florida was becoming an albatross. Spain was strapped for money. Her army was declining in power. She was having all kind of trouble in Mexico, which would get its independence completely in 1821. She was having trouble in other areas. When the Mexican domino fell, others would fall. Eventually, Spain, not too distant future, would lose all of her Western European empire. But she was in trouble, and she couldn't really handle Florida. She didn't have the soldiers, the Navy. And if a war broke out, it would be the English Navy that could do whatever they wanted in Florida because they were so powerful. So what are you going to do? And Florida was a pain to us because runaway slaves would make their way into Florida. And the Indians, especially the Seminoles, who were a very ferocious tribe, very tough. The Seminoles would give them cover because they hated the American whites. And in Florida State, the Seminoles, the last major Indian tribe to make any kind of a peace treaty with the United States was the Seminoles. They fought to the end, really. So the Seminoles were helping the runaway slaves, and also the Seminoles were attacking out of Florida into Georgia, which was a very valuable cotton-producing, everything-producing state, okay? All right, so in 1818, President Monroe orders General Andrew Jackson, and this is Mr. Lightning in a Bottle, the great hero of the War of 1812. I would argue the most important political figure in American history. Andy Jackson and only Andy Jackson could say this: one major party was created to make me president, the Democrats. I was the first Democrat president. That party has never gone away. It elected me in 1828 and it elected Joe Biden in 2020. What are you laughing at? All right, similarity there. Okay, but really, and the Democrats held their first convention in 1832 to renominate Jackson for a second term. And believe it or not, the Democrats, in good times and bad, have never missed a convention since 1832. One of my professors, who was a diehard Republican, always said they're not conventions, they're quadrennial convulsions. In the part of the one convention took 103 ballots to nominate somebody, which is unbelievable. Then they nominated a guy named John Davis. At least they could name Gutlunis or Kowalski or something. 103 ballots, 10 days, and you nominate a Davis or a Smith. Come on, be a little creative here. But anyhow, the Andrew Jackson, and he was so loved and so hated. His opponents called him King Andrew, that a party eventually took the name Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, that they rose up to oppose Andrew Jackson, and they eventually would become, at least the Northern Whigs, Republicans later on. But the Whigs would give us Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and Abraham Lincoln, and again, by the 1850s, almost all of the Northern Whigs did become Republicans. So Jackson was a very important guy, and he was now riding high, not president yet, but he was the second or third highest ranking general in the American Army. And if you want trouble, you send Jackson. If there's no trouble, he'll create it. So what they did, Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who's going to be the next president, they say to Jackson, go to the border. You can even make an incursion into Florida if necessary. That's like telling Jackson, go into Florida. And take care of the situation. But don't create an international incident. In other words, murder somebody, but don't get caught. So Jackson goes in. Does he cause an incident? Yeah. He conquers St. Mark's and Pensacola, two of the most important cities in that, what they call West Florida. He arrests the Spanish governor, declares himself martial law governor, finds two Englishmen trading with the Indians, and he orders them executed. And they say, well, we want a trial. He said, well, here's a trial. I'm the judge, I'm the jury, you're guilty, hang them. Just like that. He hung two Englishmen. He invaded Florida. He captured two Florida cities. I mean, he has the Indians in an uproar. Jackson gets away with it. So then the Spanish and the British are screaming and yelling, and Monroe is getting nervous. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? John Quincy Adams says, nothing. Let me handle it. John Quincy Adams, I think the greatest Secretary of State we ever had. John Quincy Adams, who came up with the Monroe Doctrine, incidentally, but that's another story. John Quincy Adams said to the Spanish, Jackson did wrong. He exceeded his orders. We couldn't control. We didn't know. The plausible deniability, they call it. Right? Hell, they didn't know what he was going to do. And he said, but that proves you can't control Florida. So I'll tell you what, give it to us. We're not going to buy it. What? Notice how we talk to a weak country. Give it to us or else. What would we said to England, please? But not to Spain. Remember? Why did we fight Mexico and negotiate with England? Mexico is weak and England is strong. Okay. So Andrew Jackson really does a good job here if you happen to be an American. And surprisingly, when Quincy Adams starts negotiating with the Spanish ambassador, a guy named Onís, they come up with the Adams-Onís Treaty or the Florida Treaty or the Transcontinental Treaty, and here's what it is. Spain gives us Florida. We didn't give them $5 million. Every high school history textbook when I was around said we bought Florida for $5 million. That's so wrong. Spain gave us Florida and admitted that they had created a situation that caused $5 million worth of damage to American citizens. So we assumed that debt of $5 million and paid our own citizens. So we didn't give Spain a nickel. We gave the $5 million to Americans, most of whom happened to be big ship owners and landowners, right? Didn't go to the common folk, but whatever. We didn't give Spain a nickel. We agreed to set up a commission which would investigate what damages Jackson had done, and they came up with this silly number that Jackson had caused $1,471.44. How'd they come up with 44 cents? Sales tax, right. That drives me nuts in California. Delaware has no sales tax. And everything's, even up, and so, but whatever. So we gave Spain that million, but that was for damages that was really given to their own people. It wasn't given directly to the Spanish government, so to speak. So Spain gave us Florida. We didn't buy it, they gave it to us. And that included the whole panhandle of what we now call the panhandle of Florida, like Pensacola and all that. All right, but all the way over to New Orleans. So now we had a clear title of New Orleans, which we already did, and that whole area between Florida, we're in good shape. That was called West Florida, what we now call the Panhandle, and the main area of Florida was called East Florida. All right, but what did Spain get beyond $1 million worth of damage that Jackson had done? What was the boundary between Spanish territory and Louisiana that we had just purchased 16 years earlier? It wasn't clear. We agreed to draw the boundary this way. This is why it's called the Transcontinental Treaty. See that red line? All the way out to the west coast. That would be where Louisiana American territory ended and Spanish territory began. See that? Is it clear enough? Hope I'm being clear here. So what Spain got is they wanted the boundary drawn that way, which really made sense if you study the mountains and all the topography. And Spain, any claim that Spain had to the Oregon country, and she had a weak claim, Spain gave up that claim. So we're getting our paws deeper into what? Oregon. Treaty of 1818, we're getting it in there. 1819, what? We're not thinking about Oregon in the future. The hell we're not. Seattle Seahawks used to be a good team. So want to make sure Pete Carroll has a job. All right. So the Adams-Onis East Treaty, we get Florida given to us. We pay some damages. We agree to draw the boundary that way. And Spain, as a side note, gives up any vague claim she had to the Oregon country. But this area here, what is now the Gulf area of Texas, this brown area, that area some people thought was part of Louisiana, some thought not. We gave up that area, which was the Tejas area. So we gave up any claim we had to the future, what would be the future Texas. But Governor Abbott knew we'd be back. You're darn right. So we gave up Texas what? Temporarily. Would we be back for it? Oh, no, not for at least 20 years. All right. So, but it was a great treaty, and American luck. Spain is declining. Spain's in trouble. Spain's Navy can't defend even Florida, much less Texas. So let's give the United States, they're going to take it anyway, just like they took everything else, so we made out. Now, the Webster-Ashburn Treaty, if you're from Maine, if you're a Susan Collins fan from Maine, all right, here we go. It only rains in the plain of Maine, right? That was My Fair Lady, right? My Fair Lady? Yeah. Only rains in Spain and the plain. Where does that one go? My Fair Lady, right? Yeah. Okay. I used to go to, I was in an area where we had summer stock. That was great stuff. Saw all these young, but I saw all the place, damn Yankees and Guys and Dolls and all that. Yeah, I wasn't just a barroom kid. Granted, I have a six-pack behind me but all right, what about Maine? This is another settlement that helps create goodwill between the United States and England and the United States and Canada. And again, Canada did not get Dominion status till 1867. Okay, still in the Commonwealth. That green area up there, along the Aroostook River, that dark green and light green, that was 12,000 square miles. It was very valuable for timbering at this time, and most ships were still made of wood. And it was also valuable for fur trading, fur trapping. Still, it was kind of being trapped out, but that area was never clearly defined. Who owned what? In the Paris Conference of 1783, when we got our independence, there was a map that delineated where Canada ended and Maine began. Maine was then part of Massachusetts. It was separated in 1820 and it was a separate state. But anyhow, I don't want to get too much trivia here. There supposedly was a map signed by Benjamin Franklin, one of our negotiators, that clearly said who owned that area, but the map was lost. And in the 1840s, late 1830s and 40s, there was a lot of tension up there. Some Irish Americans were trying to invade Canada to help the independence movement in Ireland, which was very bitter at that time. There was lumberjacks were fighting each other, not only in barrooms, but literally there were gangs of lumberjacks that would attack each other, Canadian versus American, and there was the Robin Hood type people. So it was a mess. And Webster was our Secretary of State, the great Daniel Webster, great 7th of March speech he would eventually make. Daniel Webster met with the British representative, Lord Ashburton. Now, our relations with England were not that great, though they were better than they had been, thanks to the Treaty of 1818 and other agreements. Webster was one of the few Americans the English respected. One of the big gripes England had against us, and I really sympathize with them now that I know the truth, we didn't have copyright laws like England had. So guys like Charles Dickens or somebody would write a book and some American would take it over and put his name on and sell it here. And it wouldn't be protected. Imagine that. Hey, James Patterson, I'm from Lithuania. I'm going to take your. Okay. But anyway, Webster was respected because he was a lawyer, a great lawyer, and he knew some of the gripes that England had and things like copyright and all were actually justified. Lord Ashburton was one of the few Englishmen that really liked the United States. In fact, he married a wealthy American woman. And there's nothing better than marrying an American woman than marrying a wealthy American woman, right? So Lord Ashburton had it good too. And they wanted to make a compromise, and they did. We got 7/12 of the land along the Aroostook River, and that lumberjack war is often called the Aroostook War. But we got 7/12 and England 5/12. We got 7,000 square miles. They got Canada, England, got 5,000 square miles. All right. Now, the Americans, especially the people in Maine, they were very angry. But Webster called in some representatives from Maine. He said, look, I found that map. You know that lost map that Franklin signed in 1783? I found it. Here it is. And he brings out this old crumbly map. He said, and this map shows that England has a right to all of this land. So we ought to compromise here. Yeah. And all of a sudden, Maine's having a party for Daniel Webster. Hey, what about Lord Ashburton? Well, he goes back to Parliament and we've been giving in to these Americans too much. Now, we're going to stand our ground here. Well, wait, guys. You know that map that was lost? Yeah. I found one. I found it. Yeah, signed by Benjamin Franklin. Yeah, and it shows the stupid Americans, they have all that. It's their land. And they think they're so smart. They're stupid. I have the map. So we're going to get 5,000 square miles, and we're going to put it to the Americans. Sign. Both of them were lying. Neither one had the right map. But they got it through. It's called the Battle of the Maps. Later on, although some historians would question this, later on a map did turn up, which appeared later, that appeared to be the right one, and it appeared we had more of a claim than England did. But was it worth the settlement? Sure. And one of the reasons, beside the phony maps, that England agreed to this was they wanted to build a map, and I know there's some Canadians here. They wanted to build a road, the Canadians, from Quebec to Halifax. I don't know if there's a highway there now or no. But anyway, this road back then would go this way. And it all the way down and then across. So the Halifax to Quebec route. And the best way to build that route was to cut through this area here. So as long as England got that northern part, that 5,000 square miles there, that was a good area through which to build a major part of this highway. So England was more than willing to compromise. It was the Battle of the Maps. Who got the better of it, I don't know. But I think in the long haul, we made better friends of the Canadians. We made better friends of the British. And I think it worked out for everybody, right? As long as you didn't have to happen to be a lumberjack from Maine, I guess. All right, now, you want to go to the big one? The Mexican War, we're going to get Texas, we're going to get New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada. All right, let's go. This is the big one. Mexico got its independence in 1821 through the Treaty of Cordoba. Some people have a slightly different date, but that's the one generally accepted. Father Hidalgo started the big revolution in 1810, but by 1821, the Spanish gave up on Mexico and they signed this treaty, which in essence gave Mexico its free reign. All right. Mexico then made a big mistake. Because it could not develop Texas or Tejas, its northern province, they decided they'd invite Americans to come in. Big mistake. Americans could come in and they'd give us land almost for nothing. Just develop it, pay taxes. We're going to be happy because we're just not in a position to develop this. Now, the only thing they asked of us is that we become Mexican citizens, reasonable, and support the Catholic Church. Not reasonable. Because most of the people that came into Texas were from the South, and in the South at this time there were almost no what? Catholics. In fact, in the whole country there weren't that many Catholics except the Irish who were just beginning to pour in. So Mexico wasn't aware of that, wasn't that little subtlety. But as long as you come in, and you can't have slaves, because Mexico abolished slavery. Yeah. So Southerners who are Protestant and have what? Slaves, they're going to come into Texas, get land for nothing or almost nothing. They're going to give up their slaves and go to the Catholic Church, and then give up birth control. No, they're not going to do that. So, but Mexico, all right, they kind of looked the other way. And that was in the 1820s. Stephen Austin was the main guy that went. Austin is now the capital of Texas, but Austin was the main. What Mexico would do is give these huge land grants to people like Stephen Austin, and then he'd parcel them up and sell them like a realtor, developer now, or land developer more properly. Okay, so Texas became part of Mexico. By 1836, there were way, way, way more Americans living in Texas or Tejas than Mexicans. And tensions were rising, mainly over slavery. The Texans absolutely wanted to keep their slaves. When Mexico said you can't, they just kept them anyway. And it was a standoff, really. So in 1836, the Americans rose in revolt, especially after a guy named Santa Anna, the legendary Jose de Santa Anna, by 18 named Santa Anna. Became the kind of dictator of Mexico. He was in and out of president of Mexico about 8 times, but whatever. But Santa Anna was a very dictatorial guy, and he was not going to take our nonsense. We weren't going to take his, and all right. So the Texans rise in revolt. And the most famous battle of the Texas Revolution of 1836 was a battle they lost, the Alamo. In March of 1836, after a siege of several weeks, the Alamo fell. Davy Crockett died there, Jim Bowie, William Barrett Travis. If you study the Alamo, which I've done, absolute idiots to stay there. Why they stayed to try to protect the little mission against 5,000 Mexican troops, 180 Americans. But they weren't really Americans, they were officially what? Texans. Now, guys like Crockett and all came in, but they had the idea that as soon as they came into Texas, agreed to fight, they'd get these land grants, and okay. So it really wasn't a battle that we had anything directly to do with. It was a Texas-Mexico. Then there was another defeat for the Texans where a bunch of them were killed at no quarter, at the Alamo. We now think Davy Crockett lived till his surrender, but then since Santa Anna had blown the Agueldo, that was a tune which said no quarter. Either you surrender now or when we win, we kill everybody. Crockett actually survived with about 8 other guys, but then they were executed by Santa Anna. Whatever, we're not sure, because every American that was in there or every Texan was killed. All right, then there was another defeat at Goliad, where a whole bunch of Americans were killed. But then the Texas Army, under the leadership of Sam Houston, a lot of things named after Sam Houston. Sam Houston leads an American Texas, leads a Texas army that defeats Santa Anna at a battle called San Jacinto. We're on San Jacinto. A lot of people apparently don't know where this street is, because I had some people couldn't find the place yesterday. I didn't know where it was. But at the Battle of San Jacinto, Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna, literally puts a gun to Santa Anna's head. Literally puts a gun. And Sam Houston was a big-time drinker. The Indians had a name for him when he lived with them, and he translated to Big Drunk. But Sam Houston puts a gun to Santa Anna's head, and he's like shaking, nothing like a drunk holding a gun to your head. That's real good. He said, if you sign this treaty declaring Texas independent, I will not kill you. I'll let you go. But if you do not sign that treaty right now, I'm pulling the trigger. And when Sam Houston said, you can pull the trigger, you can pull the trigger. Santa Anna signed. Then a few days later, he repudiated the treaty, said it was coerced. Isn't that a lying? Just because a guy had a gun, that doesn't mean it was coerced. All right, so this is 1836. Texas now claims its independence, but Mexico would not recognize that. Now, let me be slow and sure. For the next 9 years, Texas was an independent republic. She immediately asked to be annexed to the United States, but we said no because of the slavery issue. Texas was this huge area, and it could be carved into several slave states. In fact, in the Compromise of 1850, Texas was, I'm sorry, Governor Abbott, Texas was given the option of turning into 5 states. Imagine 5 Ted Cruzes instead of 1. Wouldn't that be? Tucker Carlson would have a ball. He'd 5 straight days, he'd get the best ratings. But anywho, Mexico claims Texas. Texas is the independent republic. Their flag was red, white, and blue, 1 star. It was the lonely star because it wanted to join the other stars. And it did become the 28th star. We did add Texas, of course, and that became the 28th state. All right, now, the reason I want to be fair here. Texas was an independent republic for almost 9 years. Mexico could not win back 1 inch of Texas. And in 1844, really 1845, we annexed Texas. And that caused a war with Mexico and us, which we won and then took California, Nevada, the whole thing. So it all hinged on Texas. Now, James Knox Polk was president by then. I'll get into that in a second. And Polk more or less forced the Mexican War because we had Texas, but we wanted California. Why, I couldn't imagine. All right, but so yes, but many people rant and rave and say the United States was completely guilty. We forced the Mexican War. We're damn imperialists. To some extent, that's correct. But after 9 years, we let Texas stand as an independent country, very weak. I mean, shuddering that England might come in or France or Mexico might somehow rejuvenate itself. But for 9 years, if you wait 9 years, is that long enough? I think so. In our defense, we did wait 9 years. If you're engaged for 9 years, shouldn't you get married? I mean, nowadays, no, it's different. But in the old days, remember you used to get engaged, right? Remember babies used to come 9 months at least after you got married? All right, that's all out of the books now. Okay, but anyway, when we annexed Texas, that caused the Mexican War. So, I think we were not unjustified after waiting 9 years. But by 1844, there was a tremendous idea that either we better take Texas or it's going to make an alliance with England or France to make sure that it doesn't get conquered again by Mexico. Because while it had a decent enough army to defend itself against Mexico, Mexico had a lot more people, and in the long haul, it might not be viable. So, in the election of 1844, I think one of the most unheralded, yet one of the most important elections in all of American history. The big issue, not the only issue, please note I'm saying this in case my doctoral advisor comes out of the grave. I don't want him to get mad at me. There were other issues in 1844, as there are in every presidential election. But the big issue, certainly, was Texas. Should we annex Texas or not? Many people, most of the Whigs who nominated Henry Clay to the right, Henry Clay and the Whigs, who tended to be a little stronger in the north along the cities. Clay himself was from Kentucky, but the Whigs and Henry Clay, their position was, now get this, talk about politicians weaseling. And Henry Clay, to me, was the greatest American politician maybe ever. But weaseling, he said, he and the Whigs say, we're against the immediate annexation of Texas because it would mean war with Mexico. What does that mean? I'm against the immediate annexation of Texas. What about tomorrow? What about the next day? What about a month from now? See, I'm not against it because it would mean war. What if we could get Texas, maybe pay Mexico? Then what? Well, I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. So the Whigs try to vacillate. And at their convention, they nominate Henry Clay, who ran for president for the third time, and the third time he lost. The only other guy that ran on a major ticket 3 times and lost 3 times, William Jennings Bryan. Henry Clay once said, "I'd rather be right than president." And somebody in the audience yelled out, "You'll never be either." But he was a lightning rod. I mean, he was a lightning rod, like Jackson. He was Jackson's main rival. In fact, on his deathbed, Jackson was asked, I mean, Jackson's dying. He's dying. He knows he only has maybe minutes to live. And one of his friends, and he always wanted to be called General Jackson, not President Jackson. And he said, "General Jackson, what's your last thought? You have any regrets?" He said, "Yeah, I didn't shoot Clay and hang Calhoun." Nice guy. On his deathbed, he's sorry he didn't kill one guy and hang another. Okay, Andy, you're a heck of a nice guy. But anyway, the Whigs try to vacillate. The Democrats, on the other hand, they come out unabashedly for the immediate annexation of Texas. And they nominate a dark horse, a guy that wasn't expected to get the nomination. Our first true dark horse at any convention comes from behind. Nobody expected it. But because of the brouhaha about Texas, the Democrats nominate a compromise candidate named James Knox Polk, who did have the blessing of his mentor, Andrew Jackson, who was still alive. Jackson would die in 1845, but he was still alive in 1844. Polk was his protege. In fact, they called him Young Hickory. Jackson was Old Hickory, and Polk was Young Hickory. So Polk gets the nomination. He's an unabashed slave owner. And he said he wants to take Texas immediately. He means war. Mexico, fine. I'll beat Mexico and I'll take California. And he also says, I'm going to take all of Oregon. Supposedly, he says 54-40 or fight. He doesn't. That 54-40 was the northernmost, 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude. That was the northern boundary of Oregon. I'll show you a map in a sec. But Polk never said that in 1844. He did in 1846 after he became president. But here was Polk's strategy, Democrat strategy, which worked. He would say he wanted Texas and perhaps California and all the area in between, minor area, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, nothing important, okay? But he also, to placate the North, especially the people in the North that lived in the West, the northern Louisiana area, he said, I also want to take what? Oregon, although he said, I'll settle the Oregon dispute. Notice we're going to settle the Oregon dispute. Presumably, we're going to take 54-40 now, but we're going to take Texas. Mexico, if they don't like it, tough, we'll fight a war. England, we'll see. But many people later on yell 54-40 or fight. We didn't get that. We split Oregon. All right, so there are many issues in 1844. Please remember that. But one of the issues was, of course, Texas. It's a very, very close election. And let me go back. Go back, Bill. Go back. Oh, there it is. All right, it's very close. In the electoral vote, it's fairly easy. Polk wins fairly easily in the electoral vote, but he carries Pennsylvania and New York, the 2 biggest states at that time, by a very, very thin margin. In fact, Mr. Pillow is still counting the votes there, and it might be overturned. But he carried Pennsylvania and New York by slim margins, and there was a lot of accusation of voter fraud back in 1844 because there was no registration. You voted, you just handed in a ticket. But that was true until really the late 1800s when we got registration and secret ballots and stuff like that. All right. And the popular vote was really close, 50% to 48% for Clay, 50% for Polk, and an anti-slavery party called the Liberty Party got 2%. Very close election, one of the closest in our history. And not to make a joke, was there any voter fraud? If there were in 1844, I think there was some. It was probably in New York and a couple cities like that where the Irish political machines had a way of voting people from the grave and elsewhere. So yeah, I think Clay had some argument there in 1844 because it was so close in New York, so close in Pennsylvania. Believe me, as a Pennsylvanian, and I've written a paper about this election in Pennsylvania, the last guy Pennsylvania should have voted for was Polk, because he was against a high tariff. Clay was for a high tariff. And Pennsylvania was the most tariff conscious. That was tax on foreign goods coming into America. Tariff. Trump popularized the idea again, the tariff thing. No, I'm serious. It became a big thing with Trump. Tariff, Chinese goods and all. Well, that's going to sell in America because you're going to tax only what? Foreign goods. That helps American business. I mean, logically, yeah, okay. And Clay was for a high tariff. In fact, my hometown, or right next to my hometown, my county seat was Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and it was a coal town, and it was very conscious of the tariff. Wanted a very high tariff because British coal could undersell Pottsville coal in Pottsville. What? But it could. So they wanted a high tariff. We wanted a high tariff on, and in fact, Henry Clay only has 2 statues dedicated to him anywhere in the country, one in his hometown near Lexington, Kentucky, and the other one in my hometown, Pottsville. Statue of Henry Clay. And that's because of his view on the tariff. Pennsylvania should not have voted for him. But anyhow, or voted for Polk. Anyhow, Polk wins. Now, John Tyler is still president. In these days, the president did not take office till March 4th. So Clay wins in November. You following me? John Tyler, who wasn't renominated by anybody, he was a man without a party. Everybody hated Tyler. Whigs, Democrats, everybody. All right. Tyler, trivia, it really makes sense. He has a distinction. He produced more kids than any president, 15. And if you Google him tonight, I mean, 15 kids. This guy, I don't want to say he's ugly, but he damn well was aesthetically challenged. But he produced 15 kids, 8 by his first wife. He's very wealthy. First wife dies. You know what happens. Marries a much younger, a woman 30 years younger, and produces 7 kids with her. The last one was born when he was 71. His mailman was 18, but take that. Amazing. Tyler still has a grandson that's alive. He had 2. One died last year. There's still a grandson of John, a direct grandson of John, because his second wife was 30 years younger. The only presidents that had these big gaps between them and their wives were Cleveland, who was 28 years older than his wife. Trump was 24, I think, older than, right, Melania. And then Tyler was 30 years younger than his second wife. Wow. And when she had her last child when she was 40, but he was 70, over 70. Okay. So Tyler wanted some glory before he went out. And he was a Virginia slave owner, totally supported slavery, total racist, the whole bit. So Tyler wants to get Texas in the Union while he's president. If I had all those kids and grandkids, I'd want some legacy too. So Tyler wants this legacy, and the reason I told you that story is because he realized he's going to have a heck of a lot of offspring and grandchildren, and he lives to see great-grandchildren. And if he'd be alive today, he'd still have a grandson. I mean, you know, not a great-grandson, a grandson. Woo! Okay. So Tyler now maneuvers. He has between November and March 4th of 1845 to bring Texas in. He maneuvers, and he gets Congress to annex Texas by a joint resolution, and he got away with it. It should have been a treaty. Texas was an independent country, and the way we deal with independent countries is through a treaty. But a treaty has to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Try to get 2/3 of anything in Congress today. Try to get 50. Ask Biden if he's going to get 50% today, much less 67%. So Tyler knew he couldn't get it through by a treaty. So he makes an argument that we can annex Texas by a joint resolution. What's the difference? A joint resolution has to be approved by both the House and the Senate, but only by majority vote. And the House overwhelmingly voted to annex Texas, but the Senate only voted 27 to 25 in favor. That close. Nowhere near 2/3, barely 50%. 27-25. Was there any way he's going to get Texas in a treaty? No. So he did it by joint resolution. He got away with it. We annexed Texas on March 1st, 1845, just 2 days really, before he was going to leave office on March 4th at noon. So he claims he was the father of Texas annexation. In a way, yes, he certainly maneuvered to get it through. Texas accepted the annexation, obviously, for obvious reasons, on July 4th, 1845, and it was admitted with congressmen and senators in December of 1845 when Congress convened for that year. So Texas comes into the Union in 1845. Mexico immediately severs diplomatic relations. But were we wrong in annexing Texas after waiting 9 years? I don't really think so. But Polk is going to use that now to start a war with Mexico. The war itself started over this see this area here between the Nueces River here and the Rio Grande? If we owned Texas, and Mexico wasn't going to concede that, if we did, what was the southern boundary of Texas? Mexico claimed it was the Nueces River up here. We claimed it was the Rio Grande down here. A little area. Now, you know it's the Rio Grande. John Wayne never crossed the Nueces. How would it sound if the Duke going across the Nueces River? Okay, I got to go through this. All right. Well, all right. Make a long story short, Bill, and then I'll set this up for tomorrow. Polk sent an army down. He tried to buy California. He tried to buy the land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. Mexico wouldn't even talk to him. And Polk had 4 goals. One of them was to acquire California. Another was to lower the tariff, which he did. Another was to set up an independent governmental banking system called the Independent Treasury. Another was to settle the Oregon dispute, which he did. Now, the last thing he wanted, he had to somehow get California. And if Mexico wasn't going to deal on Texas, he darn well start a what? A war. But again, was he totally wrong? I'd say we were 70% guilty of causing the Mexican War, but certainly Mexico's not blame-free. Plus, their government was so unstable. Santa Anna's in, somebody else in, constantly going back and forth. They make a deal, then the next government says, no, okay. So he sends an army under Zachary Taylor, a future president, all rough and ready. He sends them to the Mexican-American border with 5,000-man army. We only had 8,000 men in the army at that time. 8,000. Imagine that. We have 8,000 in Fort Hood or wherever the hell it is. All right. He sends them to the American-Mexican border. Where does Taylor go? To the Nueces? Goes to the Rio Grande. And we provoked the Mexicans. Come on, it's your territory, come here. So finally something happens. There's a skirmish, and about 15 Americans are killed. And Polk now asks Congress for war. In 1846, he says American blood has been spilled on American soil. Was it American soil? Come on. But Congress responds overwhelmingly for war. 40 men in the Senate voted for war, only 2 against. 40 to 2. 174 to 14 in the House. That's overwhelming. Not like World War II where it was unanimous, but dang well, an overwhelming vote. So Polk had convinced the American people that American blood had been spilled on American soil. So the Mexican War starts in May of 1846. It'll go to February of 1848. And we're going to win every battle. And we're at the end of the war, we're going to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and we're going to take 51% of Mexico. We're going to take all of Texas, all of this yellow area. That's the Mexican cession. Almost 1 million square miles of land. 51% of Mexico. Please don't ever ask a historian from Mexico, why don't the Mexicans totally love the United States? I mean, come on. Were we justified? Mm-hmm. Were Mexicans blameless? Mm-mm. But were we more guilty than they? Sure. All right. And he sends Taylor. Taylor starts the trouble. There you go. And I'll talk about the Bear Flag Revolt, which was in San Francisco area. Was part of the Mexican War. We're going to have a couple other battles. But we win every major battle. We had no problem, and we forced the Mexicans to sign a peace treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where they give us all of Texas, that yellow area there, and they also recognized the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of Texas, so Duke could cross the Rio Grande. There were some people, I'll get into this tomorrow, I know I'm going right up against time now. There were some people that wanted to take all of Mexico. Take all of Mexico, all the way down to Guatemala. Now we should have. Remember Trump's wall and all that? Well, if we had taken all of Mexico, we could have easily built a wall across Guatemala. And there'd be no border problem. See, Polk knew what he was doing. There were some people that wanted to take all of Mexico. There were some that didn't want to take any of Mexico, except maybe Texas. But we wound up taking that area I'm showing you. The Mexican cession plus Texas. I'll be blunt. There were a couple of reasons we didn't take Mexico. One, we feared that once we got into the heavily populated areas of Mexico, almost nobody lived there. Very few Mexicans even lived in California, for God's sake. Americans outnumber Mexicans 20-1 in Texas by this time. Very few people there. But as we got down into the heavily populated areas of Mexico, we'd get guerrilla resistance. And the Mexicans had had civil wars and clan wars, and they were tough guerrilla fighters. And the mountains of northern Mexico, I mean, we couldn't even catch Pancho Villa there in the 20th century. What would have we done back here? We would have been murder. So we feared if we'd go deep into Mexico, it would arouse the Mexicans' patriotism, and then they would resist this guerrilla style, which I think would have happened. So I was good we didn't take all of Mexico, but there's another reason. And Polk made this clear in his diaries. He felt, here's this manifest destiny, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant supremacy. The Mexicans were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. They were Mexican, a lot of Indian, Spanish blood, and da-da-da. They were also Catholic, almost 100%. In fact, it was the state religion in Mexico. I guarantee you, as sure as I'm sitting here and sure as my grandfather's from Lithuania, if the Mexicans had been Protestant and Anglo-Saxon, we wouldn't have a border problem. We'd have all of Mexico. Dang right we would. But we weren't going to take these people who were not like us. They were inferior. They might fight us guerrilla style because they don't understand the white Anglo-Saxon ways. Okay, but we'll take what we want, and then we'll let them go. So it was a fear of Mexican guerrilla activity that made Polk hesitate, and also the idea that Mexicans were not like us. We had never really added anybody to our country yet that was not like us, totally like us. And we really wouldn't until we added the Philippines at the end of the 19th century. Okay, I hope I didn't get too complicated. I want to thank you all for coming out. I really, from the bottom of my heart, mean it. I dread the day that I won't have enough people here. So thank you. Thank you. See you tomorrow.